We've been looking at some things in 1 Samuel, and leading up to one of my favorite stories, which we covered the last time I was here with Jonathan and his armor bearer. And today we're going to skip a little bit, and we're going to look at another story out of 1 Samuel. This one, a very, very familiar story. One of the most familiar stories, 1 Samuel 17, David and Goliath. What do you want me to do, John? Move this? Okay. I didn't catch the sign language from the back of the auditorium. Fold the mic down. We'll see how that works. But one of the things that we saw with Saul, King Saul, was that he had been put into place as a king, but he had not followed the Lord. He was not a man after God's own heart. And God said that I have set up a man after my own heart. And we know, because we have the privilege of looking back on history, we know that that man that God was preparing was David. And the thing that I saw as I looked at the story of Jonathan and his armor bearer and compared it with David and Goliath, and I saw actually two young men who had a heart for God. Thus the title of the message, Two Young Men, One Heart, One God. And as we look at these two stories and we see the similarities of those two stories, we can learn what it is to be a man or a woman after God's own heart in our day. We can know and we can understand, and we can take some things away from this story that we can apply to our own lives, and we can check and we can say, okay, am I a man or a woman after God's own heart? Or am I like Saul, serving myself? I'm going to do something a little bit different today because of the story. If you look at the story of David and Goliath, it's the entire chapter of 1 Samuel, and I'm going to read through the end and even into the first 4 verses into 18, and I know that's a long portion of Scripture, but because of the story and because of the detail of the story, there's really no good breaking point in the story. So I'm just going to simply read the story in its entirety, and then I'm going to bring some highlights out of that and then make some application. And so we won't necessarily be going back and working verse by verse through the text, but we will be taking a lot of application from the text. And before we read that together, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for the privilege of sharing your word. Thank you that your word is true, that your word is righteous, that your word stands forever. I pray that we would gain from this message what you want us to gain, that we would gain from this text what you want us to gain. I pray that you would work through me, that I would simply be speaking your words, and that we would all have hearts and ears and minds to hear and willingness to do as we leave from this place. We thank you and we give you the praise. In Jesus' name, amen. 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim, between Sukkah and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 125 pounds. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 15 pounds. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome On hearing the Philistines' word, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul, and all of the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up, and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of the supplies, and ran to the battle lines and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath the Philistine champion from Gath stepped out from his line and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel." David asked the man standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You have come only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" Then he turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David, and he looked over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you should come after me with sticks?" The Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord God Almighty. Read that, in the name of Yahweh Almighty, the God who is the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give your carcass and the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the scabbard. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sharam road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistines. He said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, O king, I do not know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked. David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword and his bow and his belt. As we look at this story, if you remember where we left off last time with Jonathan and his armor bearer and how they had attacked the Philistine outpost and how the armies of Saul and the armies of Israel had come out from their hiding and had attacked the armies of the Philistines and had pursued them, you would think that at that time that there would have been a total and complete victory over the Philistines. But here they are again. The Philistines are still around, and if you would take the time this afternoon or sometime this week to go back and read chapters 15 and 16, you'll quickly find out that the reason that the Philistines are still around is because of foolish decisions that Saul had made. Saul did not fully obey the Lord. Saul went against the Philistines in his own strength. He made foolish decisions that hindered the ability of his own army to fight the Philistines. And because of these decisions, not honoring God, not seeking God, not going to the Lord for direction, the enemy remains. And we can do the same thing in our own life. We can not pursue the enemy. We cannot pursue the things that are in our life that need to be getting rid of. We may go after those things half-heartedly. We may go after those things with our own strength. We may go after those things in the ways that we think best. But we're not taking it to the Lord. We're not going to the Lord and saying, "Lord, help me win total victory over this enemy." That is one picture that we see about the fact that the Philistines are there. And another picture that we see is that as we know and understand, as we look at the Bible, we understand that David, King David, was what they call a type of Christ. He was a picture of Christ to come. We saw Saul and his kingdom trying to eliminate the enemies in their own strength. But the Philistines were never fully and completely eliminated until David was placed on the throne. When David was placed on the throne, a man after God's own heart, he pursued the Philistines and completely defeated them. And the same thing happens in our life. When we try to overcome the enemy in our own strength, when we try to overcome the enemy in our own ways, we're going to have partial victory. But when we put the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords on the throne of our lives, then and only then can the enemy be pushed completely away. Then and only then can we have complete victory. We have to put it in God's hands. As we continue down through the story, we see that they call Goliath a champion. And from the world's perspective, he was a champion. But as we saw from the story, that title doesn't remain when he stands against the armies of God. And when we looked last time at Jonathan and his armor bearer, we saw what a young man and his armor bearer can do with God. In this story, we see another man with his armor bearer. And from the world's perspective, he's a champion. And from the Philistines' perspective, he's a champion. So they have a giant, 9 feet tall. That's literally 9 feet. It's as high as I can reach. 9 feet. A giant and his armor bearer. What can they do without God? And we see the contrast between a young man and his armor bearer with God and a giant, supposedly a hero, and his armor bearer without God. And we see that contrast sharply displayed in this picture. And as Goliath came out to defy the armies of Israel, it's interesting how he perceived the armies of Israel. If you look in verse 8, he says, "You are the servants of Saul, the army of Saul." As the enemy looked at the army of Israel, he could not even discern the fact that these men were the armies of the living God. These men came forward. These men represented themselves. These men portrayed the image of the armies of Saul. Well, if you're the armies of Saul, there's your problem. If you're not the army of the living God, it's no wonder you're standing in fear of the champion. The enemy looked at them and he saw them as simply another army. He didn't see them as the army of the living God. And as he came forward, he said, "I defy the ranks of Israel." Who are you? You're just another army. I'm a champion. We've wiped out armies before. You're just another army. The people of Israel, the armies of Israel, were not living and walking in God in such a way that their enemies could even tell that they were the armies of the living God. Are we walking in such a way that people look at us and they can tell that we belong to the living God? Are we living our lives in such a way that when people from the outside look at us, do they say, "Wow, you belong to the living God"? Or do they look at us and they just say, "Well, that's just another person. Maybe a good person. Oh, he's such a good person." But are we the armies of the living God? Are we standing for God in such a way that people look at us and they see that we are the armies of the living God? Once again, because these men were not relying on God. Once again, because these men were relying on their own strength. Once again, because these men were relying on their own abilities. When this champion came out, when this enemy stood there, when this giant in their lives came against them, they were terrified. We've seen this before. You would think that they learned. They haven't learned. They're terrified of this champion. They're scared again. And I don't know how many times I read this story before. In verse 16 it finally hit me. I'm just like, are you kidding me? Verse 16 it says, these had been going on for 40 days. 40 days. Twice a day. The Israelite soldiers would run out to the battle line. Ugh. We are big, brave men. Goliath would step forward and say, "I dare you to take me on." And they would run away like little girls. Ah! Screaming. 40 days. Twice a day. Over and over again. Never pressing the battle. I would think that after 5 days, 10 days, 20 days, battlefield. They didn't have Instagram and Facebook and all those kind of things where you could take a live video and post it on your Facebook page and people could see instantaneously what was going on in the battlefield. David's brothers had gone to the battlefield. His father assumed that the reason that you go to the battlefield is to fight. Is to fight the battle. And he says, go down to see what's happening because Israel's armies are in the battle fighting the Philistines. Were the battle? Were the Israelites fighting the Philistines? No. They were not fighting the Philistines. They were simply lining up for battle and doing nothing. Do we do that? Do we day after day, week after week, line up for battle and do nothing? Or are we fighting for our God? Are we fighting for the causes that matter to our God? Are we standing on His side? Are we going through the motions? Or are we fighting the battle? And it's interesting, the contrast as we see from David in verse 20 as his father asks him to go to the battlefield and see what's going on. David immediately does what his father asked. Willing obedient. He didn't make excuses. He didn't say, well, Dad, you put me in charge of the sheep, and who's going to watch the sheep, and I can't go to that battle. I'm just a boy, and who's going to take care of the sheep? There was none of that. There was none of that. David immediately, willingly obeyed what his father had said to do, and he made it happen. He put the sheep in charge of somebody else's care. He had the responsibility of the sheep. He didn't abandon that. He was responsible. He put somebody else in charge of it, and then he went immediately to make it happen. When the Lord asks us to do something, do we whine and complain and make excuses, or do we do what is necessary to put it in motion? Do we say, okay, God, that's what you want me to do. I know that's what I need to do in my life. I'm done making excuses. I'm not going to make any excuses. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make sure that I accomplish what you said. No questions asked. David immediately went to obey what his father said. And as David approaches the battlefield, he comes out just as one of these times when they're lining up for quote-unquote battle. And here's the Israelites. They're all running out to the battlefield. They're shouting the battle cry. They're pretending like they're going to go fight. Again, they're going through the motions. They're saying the right things. But it stops there. They don't actually fight. And once again, they run away in fear because they're simply going through the motions. There's no faith there. In verse 25, Goliath defies again. He defies Israel. But he doesn't realize that he's actually defying God. He's defying God. He's got the wrong perspective. And the people that are gathered there that are talking, they're talking about what is happening in this battle and what is happening with Goliath. Actually, it was not Goliath in verse 25 that was saying that. The Israelites were saying that. Who is this man who keeps defying Israel? The Israelites had the wrong perspective. They didn't realize that the enemy was defying the living God. When the enemy comes against us in our lives, if we are a believer in Christ, if we are walking with the Lord and the enemy comes against us, he's not coming against you necessarily. He's coming against the image of God in you. And he's coming against the fact that you belong to him. He's coming against the fact that you are there to declare his glory. And he doesn't want that to happen. Any attack against you is ultimately an attack against the God that we serve. And they didn't get that. The Israelite army did not get that. They did not understand that when we are being attacked, God is being attacked. And they went on to delineate what would be done for the man who killed this giant. This man who would erase this disgrace from Israel. The fact that he would be given great wealth, that he would be given the king's daughter. Hello? You become the husband of the king's daughter, what do you become? You become an heir to the throne. You become a taxes for the rest of their lives. How does that sound? Does that sound like a good deal? It sounds like a pretty good deal to me. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that all of the worldly reward could not motivate these men to fight. Worldly reward, worldly pursuit. When we go after the things of this world, when we make the things of this world our motivation and our reward, we're not going to be motivated to stand for the Lord. It's not enough. And we have a lot of churches and a lot of people preaching right now health, wealth, and prosperity. And I hate to say it, but in this nation, as the persecution increases against this church, I didn't say if the persecution against the church increases, I said as it increases. Persecution against Christians in this country, unless there is a great awakening and a great revival, persecution against Christians in this country absolutely will increase. And if we're serving the Lord because of the health and the wealth and the prosperity that we can get from Him, because every Christian, according to some teachers, has to live in prosperity or we don't have enough faith. If that is our motivation at the end of the day when the attack finally comes, it won't be enough. It won't be enough for us to stand and fight. It absolutely won't be enough. But as we look and we see the stark difference, and I'm actually going to go ahead and read this verse again because it's a key to the entire story. We see the stark difference between the perspective of the Israelite army and of David, a man after God's own heart. David asked the man standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David got it. And again, as he went forward and he said to the men, he didn't say, "Who will go forth and fight this Philistine? Who will go forth and kill this Philistine?" David wasn't playing. He wasn't saying, "I'm just going to kind of fight him and push him and scare him back." He said, I'm done with this guy. I've been here 5 minutes. I'm already done with this guy. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And again, he got it. Uncircumcised, indicating the fact that we, the nation of Israel, are the circumcised people of the living God. We belong to God. We have a covenant relationship with God. This giant and his armies do not have that covenant relationship with God. They are standing in opposition to our God. They're not standing in opposition to us. They're standing in opposition to the living God. David understood the difference. And that, my friends, is enough motivation to fight. That is enough motivation to put your life on the line. When you understand who it is and what it is you're fighting for. The things of this world will not last. And ultimately, they will not motivate. It's when we know and understand that we're fighting for the living God. And it's interesting how his brother accuses David of coming to the battle simply to watch. And it's interesting, as soon as, here we have 40 days, twice a day, of the armies standing up and running away. I didn't hear anybody criticizing any of them. But as soon as somebody steps forward, David says steps forward to do something about it, all of a sudden here comes the criticism. Here comes the criticism. And as we saw with Jonathan and his armor bearer, as he went to attack the Philistines, criticism came from the Philistines. They mocked him. But here in this text, where is the criticism coming from? From his own people. Not only his own people, his own brother. When we step forward to live boldly for Christ, again I say it, expect criticism. Expect to be ridiculed. Expect to be mocked. Expect to be laughed at. Because people who are running in fear from their enemies, people who are not living for God, people who are just going through the motions, when a man of faith or a woman of faith steps into the picture, all of a sudden their lives come into judgment. When we are living for God, people don't necessarily like that because we are then So be prepared. If you're living for God, if you're going to step out for God, prepare for criticism. It's coming. It will happen. But it's interesting how David deals with this. He simply acknowledges it and then leaves it alone. I don't have time for that. I'm not even going to deal with that silly, ridiculous argument. He acknowledged it. He moved on. He asks again, well, what exactly is going to be done for the person who takes out this guy? And they delineate the things again. But ultimately, that's not his motivation. That's not his motivation. David goes in humility to Saul. And he simply says, let no one lose heart because of this uncircumcised Philistine. And listen to what David says. He says, your servant, humble, submission, not proud, not arrogant, not cocky, but in humility, standing against the enemy. And again, the criticism comes, not just the criticism, but all the reasons why it can't be done. Saul begins to say, well, you can't go fight this giant. You're just a little boy. He's a giant. You've never even fought a battle. This guy's been fighting since he was a boy. You can't do it. It's not going to happen. And again, when we step forward, when we go out to make moves for the Lord, when we go forward to live for the Lord, when we begin to take initiative for the Lord, again, expect people to give you all the reasons why it won't work. It's just natural human nature. All the reasons why it won't work. But again, David doesn't listen to all the reasons why it won't work. He just continues to move forward. Not only does he continue to move forward, he talks to Saul and he says, you know what? I know it'll work. And this is why I know it'll work. And as we see, David brings out the stories. David had been walking with the Lord. David had had a personal relationship with the Lord. And out in the field where no one was watching, David was in intimate relationship with the Lord. David walked with the Lord. And he had put his faith on the line in private when no one was watching. There wasn't anybody around to see him kill the lion and the bear. He didn't do that before crowds. He did that in the privacy of his own life. He won victories with the Lord in his own life. And he doesn't take the credit for killing the lion and the bear. He said, the Lord delivered the lion and the bear into my hands. And the Lord can deliver the lion and the bear into your hands too. There's things that you're struggling with. Walk with the Lord. Deal with those things. The Lord can give you victories. And then when the giant stands before you, the giant in your life stands before you, you have a track record with the Lord. David had a track record. The Lord delivered me before, he'll deliver me again. The Lord will do it. Again, we see that David's focus is on the Lord. David's focus is not on himself. And then Saul says, well, okay, if you're bound and determined to go, then at least put on my armor. And if you can imagine, if you remember in the stories of Saul, Saul wasn't quite as tall as the giant, but if you remember when Saul was made king, he was head and shoulders higher than all other Israelites. So if Israel had a giant anywhere, it was in King Saul. Who should have been out there fighting the giant? Saul should have been out there. Was he? No. Why? Because he was depending on his own strength and not the strength of the Lord. And so now if you can imagine, here's David. Most commentators think that he was a teenager, somewhere in the neighborhood of 13, 14 years old, not fully grown yet. And you have a man who's head and shoulders above all other Israelites, and he puts his armor on a teenager. How's that going to work out? And if you've ever seen the Veggie Tale version of this, where Junior Asparagus gets the armor put on him, and you can only see his eyes. It's kind of that silly. But David, again, not wanting to be disrespectful, goes ahead, puts the armor on, tries it, and as could be expected, he can't maneuver in the armor. He says, I can't. Sorry, I can't go in these. But what he does do, he puts aside the armor of Saul, and he takes what God has given him, his staff and his sling, the things that he's walked with God, the things that he's experienced God with, the things that he was used to. God has given each and every one of us gifts and abilities and talents that are different from the person sitting next to you. And each one of those talents and each one of those gifts and each one of those abilities were put in your hand to slay giants. Don't try to take up somebody else's armor. Don't try to take up somebody else's gifting. Don't think that you have to be the preacher in order to win spiritual battles. Don't think that you have to be one of the elders to win spiritual battles. Don't think that you have to be as powerful or this or that speaker on TV or this or that singer or this or that musician. If God hasn't given you those gifts, guess what? They're not going to fit. They're not going to fit. You're going to put that armor on and you're going to stumble and fall. God didn't give you those gifts. God gave you your own gifts. God gave you each and every one specific gifts. And again, I say it, He put those in your hand to slay giants with. He wants to bring down the giants that are in your life. But He wants to do it with the uniqueness of which He created you with. Don't try to fight battles in somebody else's armor. Don't try to be somebody else. God didn't make you somebody else. He made you you. Walk in that for victory's sake. So David goes to the battle. He takes what he has. And it's interesting, again, as you see the approach of both Jonathan and David, they saw the enemy. They saw where he was. They didn't tremble in fear. They didn't wait for the enemy to come to them. They approached the enemy. They said, I'm going to do something about this. I'm taking this guy out. I'm taking this garrison out. Both of them had the same attitude. They approached the enemy. They took the offense. And again, you've heard it in football, and you'll hear it. It's the same thing in spiritual life. The best defense is a good offense. Go on the offense. Don't wait for the enemy to attack. Go on the offense. Stand against him. He approached the Philistines. He took 5 stones. He went prepared to the battle. He didn't take just one, but neither did he weight himself down with 50. He didn't put so much stuff on him that he couldn't move. He took what he needed and headed for the battle. And there's multiple speculations as to why he took 5 and not 1. One of the speculations is in case he missed, in case the first one didn't kill him, he was going to be ready. And then if later, as you read Samuel and some of the other books of the Bible, you do find out that Goliath actually had 4 brothers. Maybe he was saying, okay, I'm ready to take them all. I'm going to take them all. But anyway, he went prepared to the battle. And it's interesting as David runs to him and Goliath is just, who is this? You know, he's offended. Goliath is offended by the fact that this little boy came against him. And he starts to mock him. And he starts to curse him by his gods. Well, here's a news flash for Mr. Goliath. Cursing a man of God, a man of the true and living God, cursing a man of Yahweh, the God who is, by gods who are not, doesn't do any good. Cursing David by his gods, which are false gods, we don't need to fear that. We do not need to fear that. Because greater is He who is in me than he who is in the world. And no matter what the world throws at us, no matter how they curse us, no matter how they try to oppress us, no matter how they try to silence us, it's worthless. Because we belong to the true and living God. Their gods, they have no power over us when we're walking with God and when we're walking in submission to Him. Those gods have no power over us. We don't need to fear them. And David didn't. David didn't fear them. Instead, he responds. And again, I'm going to read some verses here just because of how key they are. 45, 46, and 47. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin." And it's interesting that David doesn't even address the fact that he cursed him by his gods. Because when you're standing with false gods, you're on your own. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're on your own. And that's what David recognized here. You're coming against me. You come against me with the sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day Yahweh, the God who is, will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Interesting. Does David have a sword? I'm going to strike you down and I'm going to cut off your head, even though I don't have a sword. He knew what he was going to do. He knew what was coming. And I will strike you down and I will cut off your head. And today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saved, for the battle is the Lord, and he will give all of you into our hands. And again, David's theme throughout this whole thing is the Lord, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. It was all about the Lord. He was pointing over and over to the Lord. David stepped forward in faith. And it's interesting, as I was reading and reviewing this, it just dawned on me, it was very odd to me that the armies of Israel would even accept the terms that Goliath was giving. The armies of Israel were letting the enemy set the terms. He came forward and he says, oh, here's the rules. You fight me, I win, we all win. I mean, you are our slaves. You fight me, you win, we're your slaves. He's setting the rules. Why would we let the enemy set the rules for battle? How ridiculous is that? Don't let the enemy set the rules for battle. We're on the offensive. Why wasn't there an archer from the land of Israel standing back there when this nut job Goliath came forward and just landed one in his forehead? Why accept the premise? And don't accept the premise that the world gives us. We don't have to fight on their terms. We fight on our terms. We're the armies of the living God. We can take out the enemy. But, be it as it may, they accepted the terms, and David accepted the terms, and he fights, but he fights in the power of the Lord. His concern was to make famous the name of God. And it's interesting how he says, all those gathered here will know. Who was gathered there that day? The Philistines and the Israelites. And David said, when I take out this giant in the name of the living God, all of you will know that there's a living God. Not just the Philistines, but also the Israelites. And when we step forward in battle, when we win victories in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, not only does the world know that there's a living God, but the church of Christ knows that there's a living God. And when we win battles for our Savior, for our Lord, we know and we understand that we are on the winning side. David was giving this as a testimony, not just to the Philistines, but also to the Israelites. And David sunk the rock into the forehead, and the giant was dead. But he wasn't satisfied to just leave it like that. He wanted everybody to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the victory was complete. And so he pulls out Goliath's own sword, and can you imagine the strength of a 13, 14-year-old boy to pull out a giant sword and wield that enough to cut off his head? Strength of the Lord for battle. He cuts off the head, making the victory obvious to everyone. The giant falls down, he might get back up again. But if he's missing his head, he's not coming back. He made the victory obvious. We need to make the victory of the Lord obvious in our own lives. David accomplished what the Lord wanted. David made the name of the Lord famous. He made the victory complete. And as before, when Jonathan attacked the garrison, the Philistines ran. And as before, when the Philistines ran, that encouraged and empowered the people of Israel to fight the battle. And when we win battles in our lives and we share those battles, victories won, with other people, that encourages them also to fight. We need to fight the battle and win. And we need to share that victory with other people. When we see what happens next, as we see Jonathan and his response to David in chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, they became fast friends. And the reason they became fast friends, it gets back to what I started with. Two young men, one heart, one God. Two young men who lived for God. some of the similarities between Jonathan and David. And I want to ask ourselves, are we those people? Two young men who were totally sold out for God. Two young men with crazy faith in God. Two young men who had zeal for God and His name. Two young men willing to take huge risks for God. So huge that the options were victory or death. Think about it. When Jonathan stepped up there on the cliff to fight those Philistines, and when David stepped out to fight the giant, there was two options. Victory or death. Are we willing to pursue the Lord and His things in that much commitment? Two young men who moved forward in faith while everybody else was frozen in fear. Two young men who had a living faith. James 2:17 says faith without works is dead. They put their faith to action. Two young men who were willing to fight for God. Two young men who put their lives on the line for God. Two young men who did all of this against unsurmountable odds. Two young men who used what they had for God. And two young men who understood that they belonged to the living God. Does that describe you? Does that describe you? And it's interesting how they became such fast friends. And I spent, had the privilege of staying with my cousin Tom on the way down and back from Florida. He lives in Atlanta, which works out almost exactly halfway. And it was so refreshing to get together with him again because we have a similar heart for mission, for ministry, for the things of the Lord. He serves with the church. He's also serving as for simplicity's sake, a jet mechanic supervisor for the United States Air Force. But he serves in the church, and we have that commonality when we come together and we talk about the things of the Lord. We talk about the kingdom of the Lord. We talk about how to advance His kingdom. Do you have friends like that? Are you a friend like that? If that doesn't describe you, if you are not a man or a woman after God's own heart, we give you the invitation. We give this invitation every week, and we say, make the change. Make the change. Say, I want to live like that. I want to take out the giants in my life. I want to take out the giants around me. I want to take out the giants in my own home. Come as we sing the hymn of invocation. Jeff and Sherry, if you would come and